Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our fourth and final session for today. I'm نديم Nashif, the Executive Director and co-founder of حملة, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. And I will be moderating our session today. In this session, we will have a question and answer with Mيراندا Sisson and Dina Hussein about content management at Facebook. Especially, I'm having social media. And I will be moderating our session today. In this session, we will have Sorry, we have an issue. We'll continue from here. So as I was saying, in this session, we will be dealing with the issue of Palestinian content. As many of you already know, many Palestinian users and digital activists have long voiced their concern about the policies and standards Facebook used to manage Palestinian content. And so today we want to give you also the chance to ask these questions directly to representatives from Facebook. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests today. Mيranda Sisson is a long-time human rights defender and was the first director of human rights product policy at Facebook. Dina Hussein is a counterterrorism and dangerous organizations policy manager at Facebook, who work at the intersection of research policy and practice to counter violence extremism. Please join me in welcoming our speaker. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat box on the right. And I will ask them on your behalf. Before starting with the question and the answer, I will pass the floor for Mيراندا for an opening note. Mيranda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, نديم. مساء الخير يا جميع. It's delightful to be here. As نديم said, I'm Mيراندا from Facebook. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. I hope it will be the first of many different discussions. And as I sit here on the screen, you should know that I'm in California, but my olive trees in my garden connect me to the groves near Nablus and Jenin. The orange trees in my garden remind me of working at the greenhouses and oranges in Gaza. And the moon above the dry fields of Silicon Valley reminds me of the moon above the mountains above Haifa, Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and the Dead Sea. So I'm really excited to be here and to announce a major step forward for Facebook, a milestone, the publishing this month of our first ever corporate human rights policy. Now, this policy is an important step in a long journey. Our principles, which are to give people a voice, to serve everyone, promote economic opportunity, and build connection and community, keep people safe and protect privacy, they've been the bedrock of our everyday content work for a very long time. I'm proud that we have now codified these and linked them to the world's strongest framework for dignity, expression, safety, and respect, which is the Global Human Rights Framework. I think everybody on this call knows that human rights, we like to say, are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. So accordingly, under our corporate human rights policy, we will be taking steps as a business, as Facebook Inc., across all of our products and all of our entities, to respect human rights as defined in international human rights law and as defined in the glue that binds companies to the human rights framework, which is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. In the policy, we have 5 different sections, and I won't go on for a long time, but we define and describe how we are implementing the policy in our practical work. We talk about our most salient human rights risks and vulnerable users and commit to how we will do due diligence to know our most critical risks, like risks to freedom of expression. We will release an annual human rights public report that will bring insights and actions from our human rights due diligence to the public domain. And we're also making in this policy a commitment to report formally to the Oversight Board, with oversight from 2 leading Facebook executives, and are committing to support and promote the work of human rights defenders who use our products. So this is not obviously, and human rights law isn't obviously a magical cure-all for all of the ills in the world, but it is an important step along the way. I want to be clear that in this policy, we recognize the diversity of laws of locations in which we operate and where people use our products. We will strive to respect domestic laws, but when we're faced with conflicts between such laws and our human rights commitments, we will seek, as we are required to do as a Global Network Initiative member, to honor the principles of internationally recognized human rights to the greatest extent possible. And in these circumstances, we'll seek to promote international human rights standards by engaging with governments, other stakeholders, and other companies. So just to sum up, nobody's work on human rights will ever be done, and certainly not Facebook's. But today is an important step in this journey, and a journey that accelerated significantly after the Myanmar violence of 2017 and the Human Rights Impact Assessment that was published in 2018. We do know we will be judged on our actions, not by our words, and we're doing everything possible to live up to the commitments we are making today and in this policy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Myranda. And now we will move for the questions and answers. And the first question is, Hamle has found in our research a violent network that 1 in 3 women in Palestine suffer from gender-based violence online. And increasing numbers of women are moving out of social media platforms because of the risk associated with their usage. What is Facebook doing to protect Palestinian women and members of LGBT community on the platform?
This is absolutely consistent with what users and research all over the world is telling us, and that the discrimination and harassment that is present online is also present offline, and of course has disproportionate impacts and patterns that are gender and sexual identity related. So first of all, we do have rules, and you have rules and you have enforcement. So our rules are aware of this, do outline what is and isn't allowed on the platform. That does include policies against behaviours such as sextortion, sex trafficking, and the sharing of non-consensual intimate imagery, which is also illegal in many countries around the world. And we also have policies against harassment, like sending multiple unwanted messages to someone who's made it clear that they do not want to receive them. So it's one thing to have policies, it's also to enforce them, which we absolutely seek to do, and then to try and support users to be aware of and to use those policies. In social media, we do not know, we do not edit what people release before they write it. We have to work on detection and on reacting appropriately to reports. To support the Arab journalism community from sexual exploitation and other forms of abuse, we've partnered with Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalists, ARIJ, for a project called I Will Not Stay Silent, to train journalists to combat harassment. And that's just one of several similar policy program practical initiatives. So we're also working with ICFJ to roll out a 6-week digital security training webinar in Arabic as part of some of our social media solutions training for journalists in the MENA region. And if people want to know more about that, we're absolutely happy to share details, but it's 6 live webinar sessions, and that will receive a certificate for successful completion. We're also rolling out a Journalist Safety Guide 2021, so very up to date for this year in English and Arabic, explaining how journalists can secure information and their accounts and protect their sources and contacts. We're also trying to support other users. So for example, we're producing a digital safety guide and digital safety toolkit so that users can better control their reaction to and protections from unwanted offensive, or hurtful experience. So this is, with the waves of closing civic space and also of the increase of use of COVID, this is a particularly stressful and important time to use these tools and for us to do good work to help people stay safe online. We are also doing specific work on child exploitation and sharing of revenge porn and extortion. And we will be developing English and Arabic resources there on top of what's already have in our safety center and on a mini site which developed by a Jordanian open source association. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of initiatives we do, and we do them worldwide, but that we realize that we must take active steps to help people both give us feedback, report abuse, but take actions to protect themselves.
Thank you. The second question is about the use of artificial intelligence to proactively find and in some cases automatically to remove harmful content has increased in recent years. There are concerns of the impact that this is having on political speech and freedom of expression. What is Facebook doing to ensure that artificial intelligence developed and operationalized will not be racist and discriminatory and protect Palestinian freedom of expression?
I mean, this is a fundamental question across the entire field of artificial intelligence and across the entire field of tech, but also very relevant to Facebook. So it is something we do take very seriously because freedom of expression and the right to non-discrimination are fundamental human rights. And we are focused on creating services which give everyone a voice. So while we are increasingly using machine learning technologies to proactively detect content which may violate our policies, for example, our hate speech policies, when that content is detected, it's still very often reviewed by one of our expert content reviewers, because we realize that machines are best used to detect the content, but there are still many areas where it's absolutely critical for people to make the final decision based on strong policies, because content is always, in this context, nuanced or borderline. Our technology only makes automated decisions in areas where it is highly confident that the content violates. For example, one of the most relevant examples is a post that's identical to a post that we've previously removed for violating our policies through, for example, hash matching. And I think the world is at the beginning of its work in rigorously understanding and developing machine learning technologies that are optimized for fairness and to prevent bias. But to prevent bias in those technologies, we do already take some important steps. So and our team has been directly involved in this, and we're speaking increasingly publicly about it on our website, for example. But when Facebook trains technologies to spot signals that a piece of content violates, it's often based on content that we've previously removed for violating our policies. And we use several different techniques to ensure that we limit sampling bias when training the technology, and that we continually check and sample the decisions made from our content reviewers, the humans, and our automated systems to ensure and cross-check accuracy at the reviewer, the site, and the policy level. We also have an increasingly significant responsible innovation initiative that seek teams to help innovate products responsibly with a framework that's based on the Facebook values and strongly aligned with human rights principles. And for geeks who are interested in product development, I'm sure we can have future discussions about that work. And we have created a responsible AI team, which is a dedicated, multidisciplinary team of ethicists and social and political scientists, AI researchers, and others who are focused on understanding issues of fairness and inclusion associated with the deployment of AI. So they're there to develop overall guidelines, tools, and processes, and to mainstream within the company. But also I want to be humble and realize, as I said before, everyone is at the beginning of working out, what does fair AI look like? What does machine learning development consistent with human rights principles? What is that in practice? And I think it's important to note in our policy that we actually make a specific commitment, not just to ethics in AI, which many people do, but also to the importance of human rights in AI. So we make mistakes, and our technologies certainly make mistakes all the time, but we are working to make sure that those happens mistake less, that our appeals systems are increasingly full-fledged and functional, and that we integrate human rights principles at the level of principles in the development of products.
Thanks, Mيراندا. The next question, how does the list of terrorist organizations and individuals published by the US, the EU, Israel, and other countries influence Facebook dangerous organizations and individuals policy? How does the company work to ensure that the political agendas of those states does not shrink the space of freedom of expression on the platform?
Hi everyone. I hope you can all hear me. First off, نديم شكرا جدا على الفرصة لينا إن احنا نتقابل معاك النهاردة. It's an absolute pleasure. I'll switch back so that I don't confuse the translators. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today. And it's been really lovely to be able to see the number of people that have joined us. So I'm happy to take this question on our dangerous orgs and individuals list. To start off with, I really want to be very clear. When we talk about our community standards, we really talk about banning dangerous organizations and individuals. And this includes groups and individuals that have proclaimed a violent mission or are engaging in acts of violence across the board. We also have an extensive process by which we follow and we determine which organizations we are able to then designate and then list on our internal list for designated organizations. We've refined that process over a number of years in collaboration with experts, academics around the world and across political spectrums, expertise. And one thing I'm incredibly proud of is that our definition of terrorist actors and hateful actors is publicly available on our community standards website. So anybody can go on there and take a look. It's also its third iteration of that definition. It's a living document that we continue to update in partnership with experts from across the globe. And I'm always open and happy to hear more from people that are working on this that would like to give us their feedback on the lists and the definitions. On the definitions specifically, I wanted to highlight that our obligations in the US are to adhere to US sanctions law. But we do take additional guidance when we're making these decisions from government lists, including the UN's designations list and terrorist convictions across the world. But when we do designate a terrorist organization ourselves, it's because they meet our definitions, and terrorism definitions vary across the world. And we recognize that terrorism convictions and other barometers by which governments assess this risk can be very different and can be politicized and can be weaponized against vulnerable individuals domestically. The final point that I really want to highlight here is we really do acknowledge that there's room for more transparency here. I know that's been something that نديم, you and the team have asked for, and many of our partners in region have asked for many times. And we really are working towards transparency here, and with our previous commitments to publish our key terms and the areas where we can move more towards publishing our list of individuals and our list of organizations that are designated under our rules. But I will put in one caveat here. We have many people that work across the world and work on this specifically. And one of the pieces of feedback that I've always believed very strongly in is that when we simply put out a list of this kind, it does have its risks that go along with it. For example, we need to make sure that we don't put our people at risk and we don't inadvertently allow for these organizations to understand that they are now on this list and figure out a different way to get on our platforms. So when we talk about transparency, it is a top of our mind, I promise you all, but we're also assessing the risks that come along with it.
Thanks, Dina. As we know, the definition of terrorist and of hate speech is controversial and is often applied to political actors that governments deem unfavorable. In the context of Palestine, some parties, some sides label Palestinians as terrorists, and legitimate political speech criticizing Israel and Zionism is being labeled as a hate speech and even sometimes as anti-Semitic. How does Facebook decide what is hate speech?
Yeah, and it's complicated by the fact that in reality, there is no global consensus on the definition of hate speech, right? And it's also extremely subjective in experiencing of hate speech across language, cultures, and context. But first of all, that caveat aside, Facebook's policy on hate speech is defined in its community standards. They are online and the details are available to everyone. They are global standards, right? It is very important to realize they are global standards in order to be protective of freedom of expression and to provide a consistent framework to users around the world. Now, that framework has evolved over time, and it's always the worst framework ever invented, except that we haven't invented a better one yet, right? So we're all in this situation. But let me be clear that the framework has been developed to align with global human rights standards, and particularly the definitions of the limits of freedom of expression permitted under Article 19 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 20 of the same convention, which indicates permissible limits for freedom of expression and the need to prohibit speech that is advocacy to incitement for discrimination or hatred. So if I boil that down to a practical level, I think that that what you should know is that the hate speech policy, which has evolved over time, is quite complex, and it is framed around speech that directly attacks people, individuals or groups, based on what we call their protected characteristics, such as race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, caste, sexual orientation, gender identity, serious disability or disease, and others. We also define attack as violent or dehumanizing speech, harmful stereotypes, statements of inferiority, expressions of contempt, disgust or dismissal, cursing, and calls for exclusion or segregation. Now, that's a lot to get your head around, and there is detailed guidance in this in the community standards. But for example, it includes statements like comparing Muslims to filth, Black people to apes, or saying that Christians are mentally deficient. We've developed those standards based on guidance from human rights law, based on a review of legislation in at least 8 different rights-respecting states, and extensive feedback from multiple global consultation processes. And those consultation processes are with experts and rights holders around the world, civil society, academics, special rapporteurs, non-government organizations, activists, and thought leaders. So we do absolutely regularly review these policies, both internally and with these independent experts. But it remains the hardest and most controversial area of our policies. These are really hard rules, also because of the lack of underlying consensus, and also because of something fundamental to social media. People's posts on Facebook or Instagram exist in the larger context of their social relationships with other people. So when a post is flagged for violating our hate speech policies, we don't have that context. We just see the post, and they're often ambiguous, They may be trying to circumvent their rules or just a careless post. And we can only judge it and review it based on the content that is being shared. And that presents a lot of challenges. And I think you'll see that our oversight board, civil society feedback, is going to be focusing on those challenges for some time to come. So we're clear that these decisions are complex and we don't get all of them right. And that we always need to do better in both articulating our rules, educating our rules, and developing those rules. Because ultimately, this stuff is really experiential. If you are posting something and you believe it's reasonable content and we take it down, that feels like censorship, right? And we don't explain it properly, then that's, again, feels like censorship. But if you see something that you believe is highly, highly offensive and you report it and we don't action, that seems like complete insanity. So we do and are aware, we do understand and we are aware that people feel very, very strongly about these mistakes with no underlying consensus, and that we need to always improve our support, our explanation, and our processes.
And we'll move on. As has been well documented by Israeli civil rights and digital rights organizations and shared with Facebook, Israeli Ministry of Justice has been submitting requests for content to be censored and for users to be muzzled. Facebook must respond to the official request of authorities when lawful, but what kind of safeguards has Facebook put into place to ensure that it is not going to be beyond its legal obligations?
Yeah, this is thankfully something where our processes and policies are fairly well developed. And that's because we joined this multi-stakeholder initiative called the Global Network Initiative in 2013. And that's a group of tech companies, civil society organizations, academics who commit, but where the companies commit to protecting freedom of expression and privacy as defined in the ICCPR. And they are independently assessed against that commitment every 2 years, which is a requirement of being a member. So that doesn't make this easy, but it is to say that we have quite strong processes for taking in government requests for data or for takedown, for evaluating them against local law and human rights standards, and then deciding and communicating a response. And we do communicate about that and report out on the actions that we take in our transparency reporting. So particularly for people concerned about, for example, Israeli government or Lebanese government or Singaporean government actions, you can read this, and this is detailed very clearly in our transparency reporting. But basically, the governments can't just issue us an order or a request and that we take it down. They can't just call us up and yell at us, although many try to do so. They need to articulate a formal request through formal law enforcement channels. These have specific compliance framework and obligations. They are evaluated by a specific legal team in a process that's pretty much aligned with the requirements of lawful, legitimate, necessary, and proportionate, as outlined in Article 19 of the ICCPR. And we will respond to those requests on the basis of our decision-making. So you'll see from our transparency reporting that for governments in examples like Russia, we may receive 20,000 requests a month, right? And we receive them and we respond formally to very few. In Myanmar, I think it's clear from our transparency reporting that we have never responded affirmatively to a government request to share user data, full stop, right? And in Israel, you can see similar data available both for takedown requests and for user data. Because that's actually one thing I'd like to highlight is, while so much of the work about Facebook and human rights is focused on content moderation and freedom of expression, obviously I think users in this forum and in many other fora are aware that once governments start seeking takedown requests, they often seek to get access to user data for lawful law enforcement purposes or for unlawful purposes. And our systems as a GNI member are created and run and checked to comply with our human rights obligations there. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, so we will move on. Facebook has a set of policies. How does Facebook develop those policies to ensure there is no bias or negative impact on Palestinian users?
Yeah, and this relates to the global policy process that I articulated before. I came on board Facebook as someone who had worked as a defender for many years, and then as a diplomat and a bit in kind of social impact tech. And I kind of knew that the global policy framework was important, but when I got here, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so important, right? Because by having the global policy supporting a free and open internet, we are supporting global standards for everyone, which is immensely important to groups and communities and individuals that face severe discrimination or face repressive governance, right? It doesn't mean that we're perfect, but by starting from a global line, we are starting from a much fairer line than might otherwise be the case. And people, so we are very aware of how and why people use our services to communicate. And those values that we talk about, they're not just boring corporate values that sit in a box that never come out, but we actually do seek to craft policies based on them and to make decisions on permissible limits of freedom of expression, balancing them so that, with expression rights, you also have the right to non-discrimination, you have the right to security of person, the right to dignity, the right to privacy. Those require pretty complex balancing and decision-making every day when framing policies. And that's why it's very important that we have our new corporate human rights policy. And it's really important that we have our global stakeholder consultation process so that we can and do consult and take on board the expertise of rights holders and stakeholders and subject matter experts from around the globe, regionally and locally, with pretty much every policy development process. And if saying the word policy development processes sounds really boring, I think the reason why I'm talking it so much is in Facebook, as with other tech companies, it's actually really dynamic. Like at the UN or at national governments, maybe people update a policy like once every 10 years. Whereas in a tech company, innovation moves so quickly, user feedback is so dynamic, and technical capacities change so quickly that we can update our policies in a cycle every 18 months. We actually ship changes to the community standards monthly. That's why having a dynamic process of policy engagement and consultation is really, really important. And we do try there not just to have the global view, but that we surface perspectives and insights from really difficult national and regional perspectives, because that really helps us understand better how our policies impact people using our services. So, speech itself is very, very contested. Human rights norms everywhere are very, very contested. And we're experiencing the impact of these norms now with social media fundamentally differently than we did 20 or 30 years ago. We also know that there's a lot of geographical variation, like Scandinavian views of naked bodies are very different from views of naked bodies in Southeast Asia. And sometimes those views vary in one region or one city or in one neighborhood, which, I obviously don't need to tell anyone here who lives in, for example, Lebanon, right? So our job is to try to create thoughtful policies that uphold and are expressive of rights principles, and to communicate them to others and to support others to speak and interact using them. It's an infinitely complex job where we have a lot of work to do, and the online space is suffering and flourishing in similar ways to the rest of the world.
The next question is about fake news. Hamli, in our recent research about fake news in Palestine, the majority of Palestinians, actually 72%, have been exposed to misleading news. What is Facebook planning to do to counter misinformation being spread online?
Sure. Thanks, نديم. So that's a really good piece of information that's very useful for us to have at Facebook. Every time that we get this kind of information, we can use it internally to help us make the decisions in-house that can help us avoid that in the future. So specifically around fake news, at Facebook, we really follow a 3-part framework to improving the quality and the authentic information we'd like to have on our platform. The first is removing accounts and content that violate our community standards or our ads policies. Again, both of those 2 categories we cover in our community standards website. So if you haven't, please make sure to check that out. After remove, we also reduce the distribution of false news and inauthentic content that we can see as clickbait, that's just meant to get people to click and doesn't actually share any useful information on the other side. And then finally, we want to inform people by giving them more context on the posts that they are seeing. In addition to the work that we're doing in the 3 categories that I mentioned, we also really want to make sure that we're empowering people to make these decisions for themselves, especially around what they want to read, what they want to trust, what they want to share. And one of the things that we really want to do around that is, and we continue to do, is by rolling out new products and partnerships that allow us to build a community that's really informed on our platform. So one of the things that we do to assess the effectiveness of these campaigns and helping people better understand what to trust, we'll follow this campaign and we'll survey it and we'll ask what people have learned from the campaign. The information will then help us create more of these media literacy initiatives, as I mentioned, along with the feedback that we get from partners like yourself, نديم. And then finally, I wanted to highlight, we continue to work and expand on within this fight to make sure that false news isn't on our platform. And we really do want to make sure that we continue to support media literacy with the help of partners in the MENA region, including the AFP's media arm, فتبينوا, that's also based in MENA, Reuters in Iraq, local campaigns. We're really emphasizing and underscoring the commitments that we have to look at misinformation from both the global context, but also the regional context. Most recently, Facebook and فتبينوا developed a dedicated website, which is www.thinkbeforeyoushare.com. And this asks people to challenge the information they see on posts. And it really looks at this in 3 informative sections that touch on really important topics in misinformation. The first one is how to think like a fact checker when you're approaching a piece of content. The second is the difference between credible and non-credible sources of information. So making sure whoever you're hearing this information from checks those boxes. And then finally, making sure that all of the users understand how dangerous the spread of misinformation and false news can be, which I think at this point in the development of all of this work that we've done, hopefully the majority of our users really have gotten a wider understanding of that.
Shukran, Dina. And for the last question, for many years, questions have surfaced around the Israeli military using Facebook's platform to conduct info operations designed to shape and to influence political debate in the region. This includes using fake profiles or sharing misinformation that can be used to incite violence against individuals that are unfavorable to Israel. What is Facebook doing to combat this kind of behavior?
Yeah, and let me first acknowledge that these concerns and behaviors well predate social media, right? And are also not only limited to Facebook. As someone who's participated in the human rights movement for many years. So the question of information operations and other operations is very, very important for cybersecurity. And as part of our regular ongoing cybersecurity investigations, our teams do always work to identify bad actors who are abusing the platform and our rules. We do strive to find things as quickly as possible, and that's why we have invested a lot in people, technology, and partnerships with other tech companies and law enforcement and other experts. So over the past 3 years, there's actually been a huge increase in the work and in our communication about that work. So for the last 3 years, we've shared our findings about what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior that we detect and remove from our platforms. And coordinated inauthentic behavior is not based on content. It's based on behaviors where you're seeking to hide your authentic identity from Facebook. So with that rubric and with that policy, we began investigating and enforcing a significant increase in harmful networks on the platform. And exactly a year ago, we began to publish information about all networks we take down over the course of a month as part of regular, what we call CIB, Coordinated Inauthentic Behavior Reporting. That's made it quite a lot easier for people to understand the policy and see the progress that we're doing in this one place. And we are focused on uncovering this kind of inauthentic behavior, particularly in light of elections in many countries around the world this year, including in Palestine. So we are also not just stopping on the work that we've done 3 years, but committing to making improvements and to building stronger global partnerships to more effectively detect and stop this activity. And I should know that we do have public-facing forms where people can report investigative leads that we do assess. So while we can't comment on any particular activity, we can say that we will work with relevant authorities and governments to provide them with the information they need to understand and to know what we find in these investigations. And when we remove a CIB network, we keep monitoring for attempts by the actors to re-establish presence on our platforms. When they do, and they often do, we take them down using both automated detection and manual measures. And of course, as we learn more about a particular threat actor, particularly the very advanced and persistent threat actors that we see coming out of, for example, Vietnam, that we published a couple of months ago, we develop a deeper understanding of their tactics and behaviors. And that lets us go back and apply our learning to find more assets, more accounts, more things that are linked to these previously removed operations. So there is actually a wealth of data and knowledge that we have published about our CIB and cybersecurity work. And I encourage you all to have a look.
Thanks, Miranda. There is one issue that a lot of people are asking from the audience is about if and when Facebook is taking a decision regarding Zionism and if this would be considered as a protected group by the standard communities of Facebook. So if there was a decision taken already, or if this is something that you are taking a decision, and if there is already something you are leaning towards any side of this.
Yeah, absolutely. There has indeed been a great deal of concern. And as I say, we iterate policy processes frequently. So we are iterating and looking at the policy, but let's be clear, it's not a policy process where there's a presupposed outcome, or that we are assuming that Zionism should be a protected characteristic as other protected characteristics. But we do, in some limited circumstances, consider Zionism when it's with speech that already has other policy violating elements, such as designated dehumanizing characteristics. We will enforce against it as a proxy for hate speech. And I think that's the particular specificity we're looking at here. So there is no decision yet, but I want to reiterate, just because we are looking at a policy issue does not mean that there is a necessary decision on a policy issue, and that we are very aware of the deeply sensitive concerns on this topic and have sought to run a very robust stakeholder engagement process, as you may be aware, but that other groups should also be aware of, and that if they have concerns or thoughts that they wish to articulate, we are absolutely ready to be to consult with people about the process. But I do want to say that the fears that we are suddenly magically going to wave a magic wand and change everything about our hate speech policy or about our definition of Zionism, is not accurate. Does that make sense? Is that helpful enough?
Yes, but I guess, there are areas that this is very clear, but there are areas, obviously, kind of gray areas that this would be less clear, and the policy is less clear in it. And we, in any case, hope that there won't be taken any decision that would make any kind of shrinking the space of the freedom of expression of Palestinians. Regarding the issue of the practices of the state of Israel and the issue of Zionism, I want to ask you about another term that is also creating lots of discussion, and many of the audience are asking about it, is the whole issue of how Facebook is dealing with the word shaheed in the Palestinian context, but generally in the Middle East, I guess, but specifically in our context, because this is something that part of our political lexicon, and it's something that is being put in different places. And it has more than one meaning. And people are very concerned that this is also, if a new decision is taken on this would further limit our freedom of expression.
Sorry, Dina,
please. Go for it, Miraanda. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just to let me state before we go on that the policy process that's taking place is not about looking at whether Zionist should be a protected characteristic under our hate speech policy, right? I want to be absolutely clear about that. That is not the case. We are looking about whether in some certain limited contexts it is accurate to consider that the word Zionist may be a proxy for Jew in some certain hate speech cases, and that's particularly as a result of the speech patterns of white supremacy that we have seen taking place over the last 18 months. So again, I want to reiterate there, just because there is a policy process does not mean that there is necessarily going to be a policy change, but rather you should see it as an opportunity for thoughtful conversation and consultation. Dina, on Shaheed.
Absolutely. Thanks, Miraanda. And I will jump back into on the Zionism term. It's generally very complicated. I think Miraanda really highlighted this well, that we are trying to address changes in the way that language is used. And in this case, as is the case with other Arabic language indicators, we're trying to see how abusive actors are using this. So I think Zionist is a really interesting example when you do look at white supremacist, white separatist organizations that are trying to actively hide who they are attacking by using a different term for them. So agree fully with Miraanda on that. On the Shaheed term, the way that our policies work when it comes to dangerous organizations, which is what I can speak about because that's where I'm an expert, the way that our policies work are that they are global. And we talk about praise, support, and representation. Those are the three categories that we address when we're looking at a dangerous organization. You're not allowed to represent yourself as being a part of a dangerous organization. You're not allowed to support a dangerous organization, and you're not allowed to praise them. When we then try to look at terms of praise, we look at terms that elevate the status of a designated individual. Terms across the board, not just Shaheed, any term at all. So when we look at the term Shaheed, the question then becomes, is it an elevation of the designated individual or not? Now, there's a lot of local nuance here, which is what we're now trying to look at. We're saying our policies are fully global. Praise and support and representation is the policy of Facebook when it comes to designated organizations. Anybody who's on the US's foreign terrorist organizations list, we are legally obliged to action against. So now that we know that there is a word that has local nuance, we're trying to then take a second look and say, how do we make sure that we're pulling that into the work that we're doing as well? So that's where we're at. And نديم, I know it's not the answer, because we're still in the, honestly, Anjad, we're still in the process of trying to figure it out.
Thank you, Miraanda and Dina. Before wrapping up, I would like to ask the participants and the audience if they can help us by evaluating in the poll section the one that you can find in the chat box. So please help us to evaluate and to have a better idea of your sense of this session and the other sessions in order to improve our forums in the coming days and in the next years. In the end, I would like to thank a lot our speakers who joined us today, and I hope we clarified a bit the content moderation policy of Facebook. We still have 2 full days of activities, tomorrow and the day after, and we hope to see you all together with us. Thanks you for joining us, and have a good evening.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Iraqi from Hamlة, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. The story of the Palestine Digital Activism Forum all started in 2017. The main idea was to come up with a space to exchange experiences related to digital rights and digital activism in Palestine. The first forum was only attended by 200 Palestinian participants and 21 speakers. In the following year, the number of attendees increased to around 300. However, the third edition came at a moment where interest in Palestinian digital rights had begun to rise. This is why we decided to extend the forum to 3 days, and the forum attendees doubled from the previous year. Through the interest of our attendees and the support of our partners, the forum has continued to grow, and last year 1 million people engaged with the forum sessions through all of our social media platforms. This year, PDAF has a comprehensive program with the participation of 85 speakers and trainers from 70 local, regional, and international organizations. As of now, 3,500 participants have registered in the forum. The growth of the forum throughout the past 5 years corresponds with our need as Palestinians to talk about our digital rights. If you are interested in helping this forum continue to grow, we invite you to donate to our crowdfunding campaign and to share our story with your friends and your network. Your support is appreciated and is instrumental to our success and the development of the annual Palestine Digital Activism Forum. Click below to donate.